She promised the Millionaire CEO she would stay untouched and kept her virginity only for him for 20 years. Hi, my beautiful Mr. Peters family. Welcome to Timeless Tales of Pure Love. In the name of love and devotion, let us join our hearts in prayer. May the divine light bless Mr. Peter and his cherished family with boundless happiness, radiant health, and endless prosperity. May their home always overflow with laughter, their hearts with joy, and their lives with countless beautiful moments. May they be protected and guided by divine grace. Amen. Dear treasured readers, welcome to 20 Years of Promise, a story that celebrates the purest form of love and devotion. In the 1950s, America, a beautiful young woman made the most sacred promise to her beloved, to keep herself untouched and pure until his return. For 20 long years, Alana Rose honored this promise to Kenneth James Paul, preserving her innocence as a testament to their eternal love. This isn't just a romance. It's a celebration of true purity, where two souls pledge themselves to each other in the most sacred way. Their promise of physical purity became a symbol of their unbreakable bond, proving that true love can transcend time, distance, and all worldly temptations. Prepare your hearts for 2025's most powerful tale of devoted love and sacred promises kept. Are you ready to begin this extraordinary journey? Shall we step into this magical world where love conquers all and promises remain unbroken? The setting sun painted Pacifica's coastline in hues of amber and gold, its rays dancing across the pristine windows of the Heritage Foundation's grand ballroom. Kenneth James Paul stood at the edge of the crowd, his 25 years of life experience already marking him as one of the most successful young entrepreneurs in San Francisco. His tailored tuxedo spoke of wealth, but his eyes held something deeper, a longing for meaning beyond the endless pursuit of profits. Crystal chandeliers cast their warm glow over the gathered elite of 1950s high society. The air hummed with string quartet music and the gentle clink of champagne glasses. Kenneth adjusted his cufflinks, platinum pieces that had belonged to his father, and surveyed the room with practiced ease. Another charity gala, another evening of calculated networking. But fate had other plans. She entered through the main doors, and time seemed to slow. Alana Rose moved with a grace that made her simple ivory gown appear more elegant than the designer dresses surrounding her. At 18, she possessed a poise that belied her youth. Her dark skin glowed like polished mahogany in the evening light, and her eyes held an intelligence that caught Kenneth off guard. He watched as she navigated the room, noting how several guests subtly shifted away, a painful reminder of the times they lived in. Yet she held her head high, stopping to speak with the Foundation's board members with confidence and charm. Kenneth found himself moving closer, drawn by an invisible force he couldn't explain. "Miss Rose!" called out Harold Winchester, one of Kenneth's oldest business associates. "You must meet Kenneth Paul. He's expressed interest in your grandmother's education initiative." Alana turned, and Kenneth felt the full force of her gaze. Her eyes were deep wells of wisdom, framed by delicate lashes that cast subtle shadows on her cheeks. "Mr. Paul," she said, her voice carrying notes of honey and steel, "I've read about your work with Western Steel. Quite impressive for someone so young." Kenneth smiled, pleasantly surprised by her knowledge of his business dealings. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Rose. Though I must admit, I'm more intrigued by your Foundation's approach to educational reform. Your proposal for integrated learning centers is bold." A flash of interest crossed her features. Bold. Some would call it foolish or dangerous. "Those who lack vision often fear change," Kenneth replied, offering her a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "I prefer to invest in the future, not cling to the past." Alana accepted the glass, but didn't drink. Pretty words, Mr. Paul, but words without action are just air dressed in silk. Her challenge sparked something in him, admiration mixed with curiosity. Then perhaps we should discuss action. Would you care to walk with me? The garden here is quite lovely at sunset. She hesitated for a moment, gauging his sincerity. The garden? Where everyone can see us. Precisely. He offered his arm, aware of the murmurs their interaction was already generating. Unless you're concerned about being seen with a notorious industrialist. A subtle smile graced her lips. I'm more concerned about your reputation, Mr. Paul. A young black woman on your arm might not sit well with your board of directors. My board of directors don't own my conscience, Miss Rose. He held her gaze steadily. And I've never been one to let others dictate my choices. The garden path wound through carefully manicured roses, their perfume hanging sweet in the evening air. Alana walked beside him, maintaining a proper distance, but close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of jasmine in her hair. They talked of education, of dreams, for a future where color meant less than character. Her passion shone through in every word, every gesture. My grandmother started with a single dress shop, she explained, stopping beside a marble fountain, but she saw it as more than just a business. It was a haven, a place where colored women could feel beautiful, dignified. Education is no different. Every child deserves a place where they can grow into their full potential. Kenneth watched the play of emotions across her face, mesmerized by her conviction. Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman. She is. She taught me that true power isn't in what you own, but in what you build for others. Alana turned to face him fully. That's why I'm suspicious of your interest, Mr. Paul. What does a man who builds steel empires want with our humble foundation? The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Kenneth stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Would you believe me if I said I'm tired of building monuments to wealth, that perhaps I'm looking for something more meaningful? No, she replied honestly, not without proof. He laughed then, a genuine sound that surprised them both. Fair enough. Then let me prove it. Show me your plans, Miss Rose. Show me your vision for these learning centers. If it's half as impressive as your conviction, you'll have my full support. And what do you want in return? Her question was direct, unflinching. Dinner, he said simply, a chance to know the woman behind the vision. Alana studied him for a long moment, the fountain's gentle splash filling the silence between them. Finally, she spoke. Thursday. But not dinner. Meet me at the proposed site for our first center. Wear something less expensive. She gestured to his tuxedo with a hint of amusement. As you wish. He bowed slightly, playfully formal. Though I should warn you, even my work clothes are tailored. Of course they are. She shook her head, but he caught the smile she tried to hide. Good evening, Mr. Paul. Kenneth, he corrected softly. If we're going to be building the future together, you might as well use my first name. She paused, already turning to leave. We'll see, Mr. Paul. We'll see. As she walked away, Kenneth felt something shift in his carefully ordered world. He watched her disappear back into the ballroom, her ivory dress catching the last rays of sunset. For the first time in years, he felt truly awake, truly alive. The air seemed sharper, colors brighter, possibilities endless. He remained in the garden until the stars began to appear, thinking of brown eyes that held universes of wisdom and a smile that promised both challenge and reward. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. Inside, the gala continued its glittering dance of wealth and social positioning, but Kenneth James Paul, the young titan of industry, had already forgotten about networking and business deals. His mind was filled with visions of learning centers rising from empty lots, of children of all colors learning side by side, and of an 18-year-old visionary who dared to challenge him to be better than his bank account. The night air carried the salt spray from the Pacific, mixing with the scent of roses. Change was coming. He could feel it in his bones, and somehow he knew that Alana Rose would be at the heart of it all, transforming not just education, but his entire world. He touched his father's cufflinks, thinking of legacy and choice. Tomorrow, he would begin researching everything he could about integrated education initiatives. He would prepare detailed proposals, gather data, line up potential supporters. But tonight he would simply remember the way she said, "We'll see," and smile at the promise those words contained. The moon rose over Pacifica, casting silver light over the gambling waves. In a mansion overlooking the sea, a young man who had everything discovered he wanted something more. And in a modest home near the foundation offices, a young woman who dreamed of changing the world allowed herself to wonder if she'd found an ally worthy of her trust. Neither of them slept much that night, their minds full of possibilities and plans. But more than that, they were filled with the strange electric awareness that comes when two souls recognize something familiar in each other, something that transcends age, race, and society's carefully constructed barriers. Thursday would change everything. But for now, they existed in that magical space between meeting and knowing, where all things seemed possible, and the world held its breath, waiting to see what would bloom from this chance encounter on a spring evening in Pacifica, 1950. Chapter 2. The Power Behind the Throne. Summer descended upon Pacifica like a warm embrace, bringing with it the scent of blooming jasmine and salt-kissed air. In the month since their first meeting, Kenneth had discovered that Alana Rose was far more than just a pretty face with ambitious dreams. She was a force of nature disguised as a young woman. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Rose & Company, the flagship store of what Kenneth now knew was an impressive chain of boutiques stretching across Miami. He stood in the doorway, watching as Alana moved through the space with practiced grace, directing staff and handling customers with equal parts charm and authority. Her grandmother's small dress shop was actually a growing empire, with 5 locations across Florida and plans for more. At 18, Alana had already mastered the art of business management, learning at her grandmother's knee since she could walk. "Mr. Paul," she called out, spotting him. "You're early." Her voice carried that same mix of honey and steel he remembered from their first meeting, but now there was a hint of warmth, too, earned through weeks of working together on the education initiative. "Kenneth," he reminded her, stepping into the shop, "and I wanted to see the operation in full swing. I must say, I'm impressed." Alana smoothed down her pale blue dress. One of her own designs, he'd learned. Impressed that a black-owned business can be successful, or impressed that a teenager can run one? "Impressed that you felt the need to hide this from me," he countered, following her to the back office. "Did you think I wouldn't want to work with you if I knew you were already a successful businesswoman?" She closed the office door behind them, shutting out the busy sounds of the shop floor. "Success is relative, Mr. Paul. Your steel empire makes our little chain look like a child's lemonade stand." "Stop that," Kenneth said, more sharply than he intended. "Stop diminishing your achievements. You've built something remarkable here, especially given the obstacles you face." Alana sank into her grandmother's old leather chair, suddenly looking every bit her young age. "The obstacles are precisely why I didn't tell you. People already look at me and see a black girl playing at business. I didn't want you to—" "To what?" He leaned against the desk, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume. "To treat me differently, like I'm too young to understand, too naive to be taken seriously." She met his eyes with that unflinching gaze he'd come to admire. "Your support of the education initiative means everything. I couldn't risk losing that. Kenneth felt something tighten in his chest. Alana, he said softly, using her first name for the first time. Your age and race have nothing to do with my support. Your vision, your determination, that's what convinced me. She stared at him for a long moment, searching for any sign of patronizing or false flattery. Finding none, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder. Then perhaps you'd like to see our real plans. For the next 3 hours, she laid out an ambitious strategy that left him stunned. The education centers were just the beginning. She and her grandmother had been quietly buying properties across the city, creating a network of businesses that employed and empowered the black community. We're not just selling dresses, she explained, her eyes bright with passion. We're selling dignity, hope. Every woman who walks into our stores is treated like royalty, regardless of her skin color. And now, with the education centers. You'll do the same for children, Kenneth finished, understanding dawning. The boutiques fund the schools. She nodded. But we need more capital to expand faster. That's where you come in, if you're still interested. Kenneth stood and walked to the window. Looking out at the busy street below, he could see women entering the shop, leaving with more than just packages. They left with their heads held high, their spirits lifted. Alana had created something beautiful here, something that transcended mere commerce. I'm interested, he said finally, turning back to her, but not just in the business aspect. The air between them changed, charged with unspoken possibilities. Alana rose from her chair, her movements careful, measured. Mr. Paul... Kenneth, he corrected gently. Kenneth. His name on her lips sent a shiver down his spine. Whatever this is between us, it can't happen. You know that. He took a step closer, close enough to see the pulse fluttering at her throat. Because of your age? Your race? Or because you're afraid to trust me? All of the above, she whispered but didn't step back. And because I have too much to accomplish to be distracted by feelings. What if those feelings could make you stronger? What if together we could build something greater than either of us could alone? She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of longing and apprehension. It's not that simple. It could be, he murmured, reaching out to brush a stray curl from her cheek. The touch sent electricity through them both. Let me prove it to you. Before she could respond, the office door opened. Mrs. Rose, Alana's grandmother, stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. I thought I heard voices up here. Kenneth stepped back immediately, professional mask sliding back into place. Mrs. Rose, I was just reviewing your expansion plans. They're quite impressive. The older woman's keen eyes missed nothing. Indeed. Alana, dear, would you check on the new shipment? I'd like a word with Mr. Paul. Alana hesitated, glancing between them. Grandma, go on, child. Mr. Paul and I are overdue for a chat. Once Alana had left, Mrs. Rose closed the door and fixed Kenneth with a penetrating stare. She's 18, Mr. Paul, barely more than a child. With respect, Mrs. Rose, she's far more than a child. Your granddaughter is one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. Yes, she is. The older woman smiled slightly. Which is why I'm going to give you a chance to explain yourself before I throw you out of my shop. Kenneth met her gaze steadily. I admire her. Respect her. And yes, I'm attracted to her. Not just her beauty, but her mind, her spirit. I know the world will judge us, but I'm prepared for that. Are you? Mrs. Rose settled into her chair. Are you prepared to watch her suffer because of your attention? To see doors close in her face, to hear the whispers and feel the stares? I'm prepared to fight those battles with her if she'll let me. The older woman was quiet for a long moment. You know, when I opened this shop, people said I was getting above myself, Said a colored woman had no business running a fancy boutique, but I built it anyway for Alana, so she could see that anything was possible. She leaned forward, her expression fierce. I won't let anyone destroy what we've built here, not even a handsome young millionaire with good intentions. I don't want to destroy anything, Kenneth said quietly. I want to help build. Your vision, Alana's dreams, they align perfectly with what I've always wanted to do with my wealth, make real change, not just profit. Mrs. Rose studied him, wisdom earned through decades of struggle evident in her eyes. Love isn't enough, Mr. Paul. Not in this world, not in these times. Then we'll change the times, he replied with quiet conviction. Together. A slow smile spread across the older woman's face. Bold words, but I've heard Alana say similar things since she was knee-high. She stood, smoothing her dress. You may continue working with us, Mr. Paul, but remember, she's young, she's brilliant, and she's precious to me. Don't make me regret this conversation. I understand, Kenneth said solemnly. Thank you. As if summoned by their conclusion, Alana reappeared in the doorway. The shipments all accounted for, Grandma. She looked between them anxiously. Is everything all right? Just fine, child. Mrs. Rose patted her cheek as she passed. Mr. Paul was just leaving, though I suspect we'll be seeing more of him. Left alone again, Kenneth and Alana regarded each other in the warm afternoon light. Something had shifted between them. Some barrier had fallen, while others remained firmly in place. I should go, Kenneth said softly. But I'll be back tomorrow to discuss the funding structure for the education centers. Alana nodded, professional mask back in place. Tomorrow, then. And Kenneth? He paused at the door, heart skipping at her use of his name. Thank you for seeing me. The real me. He smiled, memorizing the way the sunlight caught the gold flecks in her eyes. That's all I ever want to see, Alana. That's all I ever want to see. As he walked back to his car, Kenneth felt lighter than he had in years. The summer air was sweet with possibility, and for the first time in his life, steel and concrete seemed less important than the dream of building something truly meaningful. With a young woman who dared to challenge everything he thought he knew about power, success, and love. Behind him, in the shop window, Alana watched him go, her hand pressed against the glass, her heart racing with emotions she wasn't ready to name. But deep down, she knew. Everything was about to change, for better or worse. And somehow, that thought didn't frighten her nearly as much as it should. Before moving to Chapter 3, I want to state that I am not responsible for any low-quality content produced by others using AI to imitate my voice. I have no other channels. I have just one channel, named Mr. Peter Stories. Chapter 3. Dancing on the Edge Fall, painted Pacifica in rich hues of red and gold, mirroring the growing warmth between Kenneth and Alana. Their business collaboration had blossomed over the summer months, but beneath the surface of professional meetings and careful negotiations, something deeper simmered. The Western Steel boardroom buzzed with tension as Kenneth concluded his presentation. And that's why I'm proposing a full partnership with Rose & Company for our community development initiative. He stood confident at the head of the table, his presence commanding despite his youth. Mr. Paul, Harrison Wheeler, his oldest board member, cleared his throat. While we appreciate your philanthropic interests, partnering with a colored-owned business, especially one run by a teenager, Miss Rose is 19 now, Kenneth cut in, his voice sharp, and her business acumen surpasses most people in this room, including you, Harrison. Uncomfortable silence fell. Kenneth could feel their judgment, their disapproval, not just of the business partnership, but of the rumors that had begun circulating about his frequent visits to the Rose & Company boutique. The board needs time to consider, Wheeler began. The board works for me, gentlemen, not the other way around. Kenneth's tone left no room for argument. I own controlling interest in Western Steel, and I've made my decision. We're moving forward with this partnership." He gathered his papers, shoulders straight. "Unless, of course, any of you would like to tender your resignations." None spoke. None dared. Across town, Alana faced her own battles. The community center was packed for the weekly business association meeting, and she stood before them, outlining their expansion plans. "With Western Steel's backing, we can open 5 new education centers by spring," she explained, her voice steady despite the skeptical looks. "This partnership, Mrs. Johnson, the baker's wife, interrupted. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" Whispers rippled through the crowd. Alana's chin lifted, dignity her armor. "Mr. Paul's investment in our community is purely professional." "Child," Mrs. Johnson's voice dripped with false concern, "we've all seen how that young man looks at you, and while we appreciate what you're trying to do here, getting involved with a white man, especially one of his standing, it can only end in tears." Alana's grandmother rose from her seat, ready to defend her, but Alana raised a hand. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand your concern, but I would remind you that when your bakery needed new ovens last year, it was Rose and Company that provided the loan, not the white-owned banks that turned you away." She looked around the room, meeting every skeptical gaze. "I've earned the right to be judged by my actions, not by rumors or assumptions. Now shall we discuss the actual business at hand?" The meeting continued, chastened by her poise. But later, alone in her office, Alana's hands trembled as she sorted through paperwork. The door opened softly. "Kenneth." "Rough day?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "You could say that." She didn't look up. "Your board meeting." "About as pleasant as a root canal." He moved closer, and she could feel his presence like warmth from a fire. "They'll fall in line." "Will they?" Now she did look up, her dark eyes troubled. "Kenneth, maybe we should—" "Don't." He knelt beside her chair. "Don't let them make you doubt this. Any of it." Her breath caught at his proximity. "The rumors are inevitable." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Let them talk." "It's not just talk." Her voice wavered. "There are people watching us, following me home, taking photographs. The newspapers—" "I know." His jaw tightened. "I've seen them. I'll handle it." She pulled her hand away. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of. You can't protect me from everything, Kenneth, and I won't have you destroying your reputation for—" "For what?" He stood, frustration evident. "For the woman I'm falling in love with." The words hung between them, heavy with truth and consequence. Alana rose slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You can't," she whispered. "You can't love me. It's impossible." "Is it?" He stepped closer, and she backed away until she hit the wall. "Tell me you don't feel this too. Tell me I'm imagining the way your breath catches when I'm near, the way your eyes follow me when you think I'm not looking." "Kenneth, please." But she didn't move as he placed his hands on either side of her, caging her with his presence. "Tell me," he whispered, his face inches from hers, "that you don't dream about me the way I dream about you." Her eyes closed, overwhelmed by his closeness, by the scent of his cologne, by the heat radiating from his body. "We can't. We can." His fingers traced her cheek, feather light. "We will." A knock at the door shattered the moment. They sprang apart as Mrs. Rose entered, taking in their flushed faces and guilty expressions with a knowing look. "Kenneth," she said calmly, "I believe you have a dinner meeting with the mayor in an hour." "Yes, ma'am." He straightened his tie, professional mask sliding back into place. "Alana, we'll continue our discussion about the education centers tomorrow." She nodded, not trusting her voice. When he was gone, her grandmother simply looked at her. I know, Alana said before she could speak. I know it's dangerous. Impossible. Nothing's impossible, child. Mrs. Rose's voice was gentle, but some things come at a terrible price. Are you ready to pay it? That night, alone in her room, Alana stood before her mirror. She'd changed into the nightgown Kenneth had sent, a daring gift that had arrived anonymously, but she knew it was from him. The silk whispered against her skin as she moved, and she imagined his eyes on her, his hands. "Stop it," she told her reflection firmly. But her heart raced, and her skin flushed with thoughts she couldn't control. Across town, in his penthouse apartment, Kenneth stood at his window, staring out at the city lights. He'd removed his tie and jacket, unbuttoned his shirt against the heat that seemed to consume him whenever he thought of her, which was constantly. On his desk lay the morning papers, their headlines screaming scandal, steel magnate's shocking liaison with teenage Negro businesswoman. The photos were grainy but unmistakable, them walking together, laughing, standing too close. He should care about the scandal, should worry about the stock prices, the contracts, the social fallout. But all he could think about was the way she'd trembled when he touched her cheek, the softness of her skin, the depth of her eyes. "Damn them all," he whispered to the night. "Let them talk. Let them scheme. Let them try to tear them apart." He'd burn down his entire empire before he'd let anyone come between them. The telephone rang, Alana's private line. "Kenneth?" Her voice was soft, vulnerable in a way she never allowed herself to be in public. "I'm here." "I can't sleep," she confessed. "I keep thinking about everything." "I know." He closed his eyes, picturing her in that silk nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. "We'll figure this out, Alana. Together. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll protect the education centers. The children need them more than I need, more than we need. I promise." His voice was fierce with conviction. "But I'm not giving you up, not for anyone." The line was quiet for a long moment, filled only with the sound of their breathing. "Good night, Kenneth," she finally whispered. "Good night, my love." He held the phone long after she hung up, listening to the empty line, feeling the weight of their impossible love pressing down on him. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more judgment, more obstacles. But tonight, in the darkness, he allowed himself to dream of a future where love conquered all, where age and race were no barrier, where Alana could be his without the world trying to tear them apart. The fall wind whistled through Pacifica's streets, carrying whispers and rumors, judgment and fear. But in two separate rooms, two hearts beat as one, defying society's rules, daring to believe in something greater than themselves. Love, after all, had toppled empires before. Chapter 4. The Promise. October 1950 arrived with an unusual chill, as if nature itself sensed the impending separation. Kenneth stood in his office at Western Steel, staring at the telegram that would change everything. The Australian Mining Consortium's offer was too significant to ignore, a 2-year contract that would triple his company's value. 2 years, he whispered to the empty room. 2 years away from Pacifica, from his empire, from Alana. He'd watched her bloom over the past months, her 19th birthday marking not just another year, but a transformation. The education centers were thriving under her leadership, and Rose and Company had opened 2 new locations. She was no longer just the teenager who'd caught his eye. She was becoming a force in her own right. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Paul, Miss Rose is here to see you." His heart quickened. "Send her in." Alana entered, wearing a deep burgundy dress that made her skin glow. October sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the gold threads woven through her carefully styled hair. At 19, she carried herself with the grace of someone far older, though her eyes still held that youthful fire that had first drawn him in. "You're leaving. No preamble, No pleasantries. She held up the morning's newspaper where the Australian deal made headlines. "Alana, when were you going to tell me?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Or did you think I wouldn't notice when you disappeared for 2 years?" Kenneth moved from behind his desk, reaching for her, but she stepped back. "I was going to tell you tonight. I had it all planned. Dinner at that little place by the beach where we first—" 2 years, Kenneth. She sank into one of his leather chairs, the newspaper crumpling in her grip. "Everything we've built here, the centers, the expansion plans—" "We'll continue," he finished firmly. "I've already arranged everything. The funding is secure, the board can't touch it, and you'll have full authority to—" "I don't care about the business." The words burst from her with unexpected force. "I care about—" She stopped, collecting herself. "I care about what we've become to each other." Kenneth knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Look at me, Alana." He waited until she met his gaze. "What we've become to each other is exactly why I need to do this. This deal will give us the power to make real change, not just here, but everywhere. No one will be able to stop us, question us, or tear us apart. If you survive the journey," she whispered, "that route to Australia, the storms this time of year." He smiled softly. "I'll survive. I have too much to come back to." Standing, he walked to his private safe and removed a small box. "I was going to give you this tonight, but now seems right." He placed it in her hands. "Open it." Inside lay a delicate silk dress. Not the usual kind found in her boutiques, but something more intimate, more personal. The fabric was the color of moonlight on water, with subtle beading that caught the light like stars. "Kenneth." Her fingers traced the delicate material. "I had it made in Paris," he said softly, "for you to wear when I return." His voice dropped lower. "For our wedding night." Her breath caught. "Wedding? But we can't possibly—" "We can. We will." He took her hands again. "In 2 years, I'll have enough power and influence that no one can stop us." "But Alana—" He hesitated. "I need to know you'll wait for me." She looked up at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "What are you asking?" "Promise me," he whispered, drawing her to her feet. "Promise me you'll stay pure, untouched, saving yourself for me alone, and I swear, when I return, I'll make you my wife in front of God and everyone." The room seemed to hold its breath. Alana's heart pounded so hard he could almost hear it, her pulse visible at her throat. "You're asking me to wait 2 years? To not with anyone? I'm asking you to be mine, completely and only mine, as I'll be yours." His hands framed her face. "Can you make that promise?" She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "And you? Will you make the same promise?" "I already have." He pressed his forehead to hers. "From the moment I met you, there could never be anyone else." The October sun painted the office in shades of gold and amber as they stood there, breathing each other's air, hovering on the edge of something profound. Finally, Alana spoke. "I promise," she whispered. "I'll wait for you. I'll stay pure for you, no matter how long it takes." Kenneth's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, withdrawing an antique pocket watch. "This was my grandfather's. He gave it to my grandmother as a promise of his return from the Great War." He placed it in her hands. "Let it be my promise to you." Alana traced the intricate engravings on the case. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. The ship sails with the tide." Her grip on the watch tightened. "So soon. The sooner I leave, the sooner I return." He lifted her chin. 2 years will pass quickly." "Will they?" She moved to the window, looking out at the city they'd begun to transform together. Everything will be different when you return. I'll be different. You'll be even more magnificent. He came up behind her, not quite touching. And I'll be worthy of you at last. She turned to face him, eyes shining with unshed tears. You already are. The moment stretched between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say, couldn't do. The promise hung in the air, making even the smallest touch electric with possibility and denial. I should go, she said finally, clutching the dress box and watch to her chest. I need to prepare. For what? For tomorrow, for saying goodbye, for 2 years without you. Her voice caught, for keeping my promise. He walked her to the door, every step an exercise in restraint. At the threshold, she paused. Kenneth? Yes? I love you. The words were soft but clear. I needed you to hear that, just once, before you go. Before he could respond, she was gone, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air like a ghost of what might have been. That night, in separate rooms across the city, they each prepared for goodbye. Alana tried on the silk dress, its fabric whispering against her skin like a lover's touch. She imagined his return, his eyes when he saw her in it, the moment when their promise would finally be fulfilled. Kenneth packed lightly, suits for business, casual clothes for the long voyage. In a hidden compartment of his briefcase, he placed a photograph of Alana, taken at the opening of their first education center. Her smile in it was radiant, full of hope and determination. The night seemed endless, yet morning came too soon. The fog rolled in from the Pacific, shrouding the docks in mystery as they gathered for their final goodbye. Alana wore blue, the color of the ocean that would separate them. Kenneth's handkerchief was damp with her tears as the ship's horn sounded its first warning. 2 years, he promised, his voice rough with emotion. 2 years, she echoed, pressing his grandfather's watch to her heart. Their eyes said everything their bodies couldn't, their promise keeping them inches apart even as their souls strained toward each other. The second horn blasted. Time had run out. I love you too, Kenneth whispered, the words he hadn't said in his office finally finding voice. Remember that. Remember me. Always, Alana breathed. She stood on the dock, long after the ship disappeared into the fog, the watch ticking against her heart, the silk dress waiting at home like a tangible piece of their shared dream. 2 years stretched before them like an ocean of time. Neither knew that fate had other plans, that their promise would be tested not by years, but by decades, not by distance, but by tragedy. For now, they had their promise, their love, and their dreams of reunion. It would have to be enough. Chapter 5. The Crash. Late October 1950 brought unseasonable storms to the Pacific. The business vessel Southern Star fought against waves that seemed determined to swallow it whole. In his private cabin, Kenneth James Paul sat at his desk, penning another letter to Alana. My dearest Alana, the sea mirrors my heart tonight, restless, wild, yearning for shore. We're 3 days into our journey, and already I feel the weight of our separation. The watch you're holding now would show just past midnight. Are you awake too, thinking of me as I think of you? The business papers before him lay forgotten as he wrote, pouring his heart onto the page. The ship pitched violently, and his pen skittered across the paper. Above, he could hear the crew shouting over the howling wind. Something was wrong. The door burst open. Mr. Paul, we've hit ice. The hull's breached. You need to... The world tilted. Kenneth grabbed for his briefcase containing Alana's photo as water rushed into the cabin. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the ship into darkness, broken only by flashes of lightning. This way! The crew member pulled him toward the deck. The lifeboats! They emerged into chaos, Rain lashed horizontally, stinging like needles. The ship groaned beneath them, metal screaming as it twisted. Kenneth could see the massive iceberg looming in the darkness, a ghostly white sentinel marking their doom. "Portside lifeboats!" someone was screaming. "Women and children first!" But there were no women or children on this business vessel, only crew and businessmen, now scrambling for safety as the ship listed dangerously to starboard. Kenneth helped launch 2 lifeboats, his muscles straining against the weather. The third boat splintered against the ship's hull as a wave crashed over them. He could hear men screaming as they were swept into the frigid water. "Mr. Paul!" The captain grabbed his arm. "The last boat! You need to—" The ship lurched again. Kenneth lost his footing, sliding across the rain-slicked deck. His briefcase, Alana's photo, slipped from his grasp, disappearing into the darkness. He lunged for it instinctively. That motion saved his life. As he reached for the briefcase, the ship's mast came crashing down where he'd been standing. The captain and 3 others disappeared beneath it. The deck split with a sound like thunder. Kenneth found himself airborne, thrown clear of the sinking vessel by its death throes. The water hit him like 1,000 knives. In the lightning flashes he could see the Southern Star's final moments, her bow rising toward the storm-black sky before sliding beneath the waves. "Alana!" he gasped, fighting to keep his head above water. Her name became his mantra as he swam, directionless in the heaving sea. Alana. Alana. Hours passed, or minutes. Time lost meaning in the struggle to survive. His limbs grew numb. Each breath was agony. Still, he thought of her, her smile, her voice, their promise. "I can't die," he told the uncaring ocean. "She's waiting." Lightning illuminated something in the distance. Land, an island, hallucination. His waterlogged clothes dragged at him, trying to pull him under. Every stroke was a battle against exhaustion. The storm began to ease, but consciousness was slipping away. His last clear thought was of Alana in that silk dress, waiting. Meanwhile, in Pacifica, Alana woke suddenly, her heart racing. The grandfather watch ticked steadily on her nightstand, but something felt wrong. Outside, the same storm that had claimed the Southern Star was just reaching the California coast. She rose, wrapping herself in the robe Kenneth had given her. At her window, she watched lightning dance over the Pacific. "Be safe," she whispered. "Come back to me." The telephone's ring shattered the pre-dawn silence. Mrs. Rose answered it downstairs. Moments later, Alana heard her grandmother's heavy steps on the stairs. She knew before the door opened, knew before she saw the tears on her grandmother's face. "No," she said. "No, no, no." "Child." Mrs. Rose held out the telegram. "The Southern Star. There was a storm." Alana's legs gave out. She clutched the watch to her chest as her grandmother read the terrible words, "Regret to inform Southern Star. Lost at sea. Stop, no survivors found. Stop, search continues. Stop, deepest condolences. Stop." "They're wrong," Alana whispered. "He promised. 2 years. He promised." Mrs. Rose held her as she broke, her sobs echoing through the house. Outside, the storm raged on, as if nature itself mourned with her. News spread quickly through Pacifica. The loss of Kenneth James Paul made headlines across the country. Western Steel's stock plummeted. Business leaders and society figures sent condolences, but Alana heard none of it. For 3 days, she didn't leave her room, didn't eat, didn't sleep. She held the watch and wore the silk dress, as if somehow these tokens of their love could bring him back. On the 4th day, she emerged. Steel had replaced the softness in her eyes. She walked into the Western Steel boardroom, wearing black, her chin high. "Gentlemen," she addressed the startled board members. "Mr. Paul left specific instructions regarding the education centers. I intend to see them carried out." "Miss Rose," Harrison Wheeler began condescendingly, "in light of recent events..." "In light of recent events," she cut him off. You should remember that I own 15% of this company's shares. Mr. Paul's last act before sailing was to transfer them to me." She smiled coldly. "Shall we discuss the future of our partnership?" They saw then what Kenneth had seen, not just a beautiful young woman, but a force of nature. One by one they backed down. Alone in her office later, Alana finally allowed herself to cry again. She took out the watch, its steady ticking a reminder of time's cruel march forward. "I'll keep our promise," she whispered. "No matter how long it takes, I'll stay pure for you, my love, and I'll build everything we dreamed of." She couldn't know that at that very moment, on a remote island thousands of miles away, Kenneth lay unconscious in a tribal healer's hut. She couldn't know that he dreamed of her as native remedies fought the fever that ravaged him. She couldn't know that his first word upon waking would be her name. The world believed Kenneth James Paul was dead. His empire mourned. His colleagues moved to fill the vacuum his loss created. But Alana Rose knew better. Deep in her heart, where their love burned like an eternal flame, she felt his presence. He was alive, he had to be. Their promise wasn't finished, and so began the long years of waiting. She would build their dream, guard their love, and keep their promise. Time would test her faith, but she would not break, for love, after all, was stronger than death, and some promises transcended even the grave. Chapter 6. Two Worlds. Early 1951 dawned cold and grey on the remote island where Kenneth James Paul fought for survival. The tribal healer, an elderly woman named Kaya, had nursed him through fever and delirium for months. In his fevered dreams, he called out for Alana, his words incomprehensible to the islanders, but his pain clear in every syllable. The island, which he learned was called Motunga, lay far from any shipping routes. The indigenous people had lived untouched by modern civilization for generations, viewing the occasional shipwreck survivor as both curiosity and omen. "You heal now," Kaya told him in broken English, learned from previous castaways. "But spirit still sick, heart cry for someone." Kenneth touched the empty space where his grandfather's watch should have been. "Alana," he whispered. "I have to get back to her." But the tribe had other plans. They viewed his survival of the terrible storm as a sign from their gods. His knowledge of modern medicine, remembered from his college years, had already saved 2 children from fever. They would not let such a valuable asset leave easily. Meanwhile, in Pacifica, Alana Rose stood in her newly expanded office at Rose and Company, reviewing the latest financial reports. At 20, she had transformed her grandmother's business into a growing empire. The education centers flourished, each one a testament to the dream she had shared with Kenneth. "Miss Rose." Her secretary entered with the morning paper. "The board meeting at Western Steel is in an hour." Alana nodded, adjusting the watch she always wore, Kenneth's last gift. "Thank you, Sarah. Is the car ready?" The headlines that morning spoke of civil rights tensions, but Alana had learned to navigate both worlds with increasing skill. The board members who had once dismissed her now feared her sharp business acumen and controlling interest in the company. Back on Motunga, Kenneth learned the tribal ways, earning his place through hard work and healing. His business suit had long since been replaced by traditional island garments, his clean-shaven face now bearing a beard. But beneath the external changes, his heart remained fixed on one goal: return to Alana. "You watch stars each night," observed Tao, the chief's son who had become his closest friend. "Looking for way home?" "Looking for answers," Kenneth replied, his command of the tribal language growing stronger. "There's someone waiting for me." Tao nodded sagely. "Woman you call in sleep, the one your spirit cries for." "Yes." Kenneth traced patterns in the sand. "I made her a promise." In Pacifica, Alana faced her own battles. Society matrons whispered behind their hands as she entered the exclusive restaurants that had once barred her kind. But she held her head high, her success speaking louder than their prejudice. "Miss Rose!" Harrison Wheeler cornered her after a board meeting. "Perhaps we could discuss the company's future over dinner." She fixed him with a cool stare. "Mr. Wheeler, I believe we've discussed this before. My personal life is not open for negotiation." "My dear," his tone grew condescending, "it's been over a year. Kenneth would have wanted—" "Mr. Paul," she corrected sharply, "would have wanted me to keep our promises, all of them. Good day, Mr. Wheeler." At night, alone in her bedroom, she would hold the watch and wear the silk dress Kenneth had given her. "I know you're alive," she whispered to the stars. "I feel it. Come back to me." The years rolled by. 1952 brought changes to both their worlds. Kenneth's medical knowledge, combined with traditional tribal remedies, made him an invaluable healer. The tribe saw him as a gift from the gods, making any thought of escape increasingly difficult. They assigned guards, always polite but vigilant. Women of the tribe were encouraged to pursue him, but Kenneth remained faithful to his promise. Each night, he would touch the scar where his grandfather's watch had rested, thinking of Alana. In America, Alana's business acumen grew legendary. By 21, she had opened education centers in 3 states. Rose and Company boutiques flourished in every major city, yet she remained untouched, saving herself for the man society had declared dead. "Child," her grandmother said one evening in 1953, "you must learn to live again. Kenneth is dead," Alana finished quietly. "Then why does my heart tell me otherwise? Why do I feel him, Grandma? Every night I dream of him, and he's alive somewhere trying to come back to me." Mrs. Rose stroked her granddaughter's hair. "Dreams are powerful things, child, but they can't warm your bed or give you children." "No," Alana agreed, "but they can keep a promise alive." 1954 brought storms to Matunga. Kenneth, now fluent in the tribal language and versed in their customs, saw his chance. The tribe believed the storms were punishment from the gods. Children fell ill, crops failed. "The gods demand sacrifice," the tribal elders declared. Kenneth stepped forward. "Let me journey to the sacred caves. I will seek wisdom from the ancestors." It was a dangerous request. The caves lay on the far side of the island, through treacherous jungle. But his position as healer gave weight to his words. In Pacifica, Alana celebrated her 23rd birthday by opening a women's hospital, the first in the city to serve all races equally. The press called her the Black Angel of Business, but she cared little for titles. Each night, she added to the letter she'd been writing since Kenneth's disappearance. "My dearest Kenneth, another year passes, but my heart grows more certain. You're alive. I feel you in every breath, every heartbeat. The world calls me a success, but without you, it's all just numbers on paper. I keep our promise, my love. My body and soul remain pure, waiting for you." The watch ticks beside me as I write this. Sometimes, in the depths of night, its rhythm sounds like your heartbeat. By 1955, Kenneth had earned enough trust to move freely around the village. His healing touch had saved dozens of lives, and even the guards grew lax in their watching. He learned their patrol patterns, studied the tides, and waited. One night, under a new moon, he prepared for his first escape attempt. He gathered herbs, food, and a tribal knife. But as he crept toward the beach, a child's cry stopped him. The chief's youngest daughter lay burning with fever, the same fever that had nearly killed him when he first arrived. His conscience warred with his heart. "Forgive me, Alana," he whispered, turning back to save the child. That same night, in Pacifica, Alana woke screaming from a nightmare. She had seen Kenneth turning away from the sea, walking back into a jungle she couldn't follow. "Don't turn back," she cried to the empty room. Don't give up. I'm still here, still waiting. The watch ticked steadily, counting seconds that stretched into years. In two different worlds, two hearts beat as one, separated by oceans but connected by a promise neither would break. Kenneth's tribal name became Healer Who Walks Between Worlds, for in his sleep he still spoke to someone they couldn't see, and in America they called Alana the Ice Queen for her untouchable beauty and refusal to marry. But the truth was simpler. Two souls, bound by love and promise, waiting for fate to reunite them. The years would test them further, but their hearts remained true. For love, after all, knew no boundaries, not of time, not of distance, not even of worlds. Chapter 7. The Years Between. The years 1956 to 1960 carved deeper lines of longing into Kenneth's sun-bronzed face. Now, 31, he had grown lean and strong from island life, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence of the businessman he'd once been. His second escape attempt had ended in near disaster, leaving him with a long scar down his right arm and even stricter surveillance from the tribe. "The gods wish you to stay," Kaya told him, as she applied healing herbs to his wound. "Why you fight their will?" Kenneth stared out at the endless Pacific, its waters both barrier and pathway to his heart's desire. "Because someone waits for me, someone who believes in promises." The tribal council had made him their chief advisor, a position of honor that felt more like chains. They consulted him on everything from healing to crop rotation, using his modern knowledge to improve their ancient ways. But each success only made them more determined to keep him. In Pacifica, Alana Rose had become a legend at 24. Her business empire now included 30 boutiques, 12 education centers, and 3 hospitals. She moved through boardrooms and charity galas with effortless grace, her beauty only enhanced by the untouchable aura that surrounded her. "The Ice Queen strikes again," whispered the society papers as she rejected another prominent suitor. This time it was a European prince, drawn by her reputation and fortune. "Miss Rose," he had pleaded, "surely after 6 years it's time to embrace life again. Your loyalty to a ghost is admirable, but—" "My loyalty," she cut him off, her voice sharp as winter frost, "is to a promise, and to a man who keeps his promises." Alone in her penthouse office, she held Kenneth's watch, its ticking a steady counterpoint to her heartbeat. She had kept his suite at Western Steel exactly as he'd left it, refusing all suggestions to clear it out. On Motunga, Kenneth found subtle ways to maintain his business acumen. He used coconut shells to teach the tribal children mathematics, drew corporate structures in the sand, and kept his mind sharp by mentally calculating compound interest on imaginary investments. "Tell me of her," Tao would sometimes ask during their night fishing expeditions. "This woman who holds your soul across the great water." Kenneth's voice would grow soft with memory. "She has the wisdom of the ancestors in her eyes, the strength of the ocean in her heart. When she walks into a room, the world stops to watch. When she speaks, even the proud learn to listen." "Yet you were not married." "We made a different kind of bond," Kenneth explained, touching his scar where the watch had been. "A promise deeper than marriage. To keep ourselves only for each other, no matter how long the separation." "And you think she keeps this promise still?" Kenneth smiled at the stars. "I know she does, as I keep mine." In 1958, Alana faced her greatest business challenge yet. A consortium of white-owned businesses attempted a hostile takeover of Rose and Company, seeking to destroy what they couldn't control. She stood before the shareholders' meeting, wearing the black dress that had become her trademark. At 26, she commanded attention not through beauty alone, but through sheer force of will. "Gentlemen," her voice cut through the murmurs, "you see before you a woman, young and black, and you think me vulnerable. Let me remind you that in the past 6 years, our stock has quadrupled in value. Our education centers have graduated over 1,000 students. Our hospitals have saved countless lives." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But more importantly, let me remind you of something else. I learned business from Kenneth James Paul himself, and he taught me that true power isn't in hostile takeovers or backdoor deals. It's in building something that lasts." The takeover attempt failed spectacularly. Alana's counter-moves left her opponents financially devastated and her position stronger than ever. That night, she allowed herself a rare moment of weakness. Slipping into the silk dress Kenneth had given her, still perfect after 8 years, she stood before her mirror. "Are you proud of me, my love?" she whispered to her reflection. "Are you watching from somewhere, seeing what I've built for us?" On Motunga, Kenneth was indeed thinking of her. The tribe had arranged a feast in his honor, presenting him with a young woman they considered his perfect match, the chief's niece, beautiful and accomplished in tribal ways. "I am honored," he said in their language, "but my heart beats in another world." The girl accepted his rejection with dignity, but the tribe's frustration grew. They couldn't understand his devotion to an unseen woman, a promise that defied their customs of marriage and family. 1959 brought changes to both their worlds. Kenneth discovered that one of the island's plants had remarkable healing properties. He began documenting its effects, planning to bring this knowledge back to civilization, back to Alana's hospitals. In America, Alana expanded into publishing, buying a small newspaper that had dared to print stories about civil rights. She turned it into a powerful voice for change, remembering Kenneth's dream of transformation. "You're becoming quite the revolutionary," her grandmother observed. "I'm becoming what he always saw in me," Alana replied, "a force for change." As 1960 dawned, Kenneth made his third escape attempt. He had spent months preparing, studying the currents, testing the properties of various woods for boat building. But a sudden storm drove him back, nearly claiming his life again. "The gods speak clearly," the chief said, as they rescued him from the waves. "Your place is here." Kenneth's body was pulled from the sea, but his spirit reached across the water, seeking its other half. That same night, Alana woke from a dream of drowning, her heart racing. She ran to her office balcony, staring out at the Pacific. "Don't give up," she whispered to the wind. "Keep trying, keep fighting. I'm still here, still waiting." 28 years old now, she had grown into her power like a queen into her crown. Business magazines called her the most influential woman in America. Social columns speculated endlessly about her solitary life. But those who looked closely could see what the papers missed. The way she touched the antique watch at her throat during crucial meetings. How her offices always faced the Pacific. The fact that she would sometimes pause in conversation as if listening for a voice only she could hear. Kenneth, now 34, had earned similar respect among the tribe. His healing skills were legendary, his wisdom sought by neighboring islands. Yet he too had telltale signs, the way he studied every passing ship through the tribe's crude telescope, how he would walk the beaches at night, scanning the horizon. They lived in different worlds now, separated by time and tide. But their hearts beat in perfect synchronization, guided by a promise that neither time nor distance could break. For love, they had discovered, was not merely an emotion or a choice. It was a force as natural as gravity, as eternal as the stars that guided them both through their lonely nights. And somewhere, in the vast space between their separate worlds, their souls reached for each other, waiting for the moment when promise and destiny would finally align. Chapter 8. Seeds of Hope. The winds of change swept through America as 1961 dawned. In Washington, voices rose demanding equality, and in Pacifica, Alana Rose stood at the forefront of a different kind of revolution. At 29, she had transformed from a business prodigy into a beacon of hope for her community. The Rose Education Centers now numbered 50 across the country, each one a testament to the dream she had shared with Kenneth. But today, she faced her greatest challenge yet. "Miss Rose," the police chief said, his voice tight with barely concealed hostility, "you can't seriously expect us to protect these demonstrations." Ilana sat behind her massive desk at Western Steel, every inch the power broker Kenneth had envisioned her becoming. "Chief Williams, these aren't demonstrations. They're registration drives, American citizens exercising their legal right to vote. And holding them at your education centers on private property," she cut in smoothly, "which my company owns. Unless you're suggesting that property rights only apply to certain races." Across the vast Pacific, Kenneth had earned a new position among the Matunga tribe. At 36, his wisdom and healing skills had elevated him to the role of chief advisor, second only to the tribal leader himself. His fourth escape attempt had been thwarted by a cyclone that nearly destroyed the village, and in its aftermath his dedication to saving lives had only strengthened the tribe's resolve to keep him. "The gods speak through your hands," Chief Mako told him as they surveyed the rebuilt village. "Each life you save binds you more tightly to us." Kenneth watched a group of children he had helped deliver playing in the morning sun. They called him Star Walker now, for his habit of studying the night sky. "The gods may speak through my hands," he replied in their language, "but my heart speaks another name." The chief sighed. 11 years, my friend. Surely even the strongest love fades with time." Kenneth touched the scar where his grandfather's watch had once rested. "Some loves grow stronger with distance, like stars that burn brighter the darker the night becomes." In Pacifica, Ilana faced the darkness of prejudice with the same quiet strength. Her newspapers now carried stories that other publications wouldn't touch: voter suppression, police brutality, segregation's lasting wounds. "You're making powerful enemies," her grandmother warned one evening, watching Ilana prepare for another board meeting. "I'm finishing what Kenneth started," she replied, adjusting the ever-present watch at her throat. "He saw a future where merit mattered more than color. Everything I build is a step toward that future." The summer of 1962 brought new challenges to both their worlds. On Matunga, Kenneth discovered that foreign fishing vessels had begun appearing on the horizon, harbingers of the outside world encroaching on the tribe's isolation. "We must prepare," he told the tribal council. "The world beyond will find this island eventually. Better to meet it on our terms than be consumed by it." His words carried the weight of experience, and the tribe listened. Slowly, he began teaching them English, explaining the ways of the modern world, always with an eye toward protecting their culture while adapting to inevitable change. In America, Ilana's influence grew beyond business into the realm of social change. At 30, she testified before Congress about educational inequality, her presence commanding attention in the marble halls of power. "Gentlemen," she addressed the committee, 10 years ago, a man showed me that wealth without purpose is meaningless. He taught me that true power lies not in what we keep for ourselves, but in what we build for others." She paused, touching the watch that had become her trademark. That man was Kenneth James Paul, and though the world believes him dead, his vision lives on in every child who learns to read in our centers, every woman who finds dignity in our hospitals, every voice that rises to demand justice. The summer of 1963 brought Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream to Washington, and Ilana stood among the crowd, tears streaming down her face as she remembered similar words spoken in a Pacifica garden so long ago. That night, alone in her penthouse, she slipped on the silk dress that still fit her perfectly after 13 years. In the mirror, she saw not just herself, but the woman Kenneth had believed she could become. "I'm keeping our promises, my love," she whispered. "All of them. Not just the one about staying pure for you, but the bigger ones. about changing the world, about building something meaningful. On Matunga, Kenneth felt a shift in the island's isolation. More ships appeared on the horizon, and with them came snippets of news from the outside world. He learned of the civil rights movement, and his heart swelled knowing Alana would be at its forefront. "Your eyes light up when boats pass," observed Kaya, now elderly, but still the tribe's head healer. "You see hope in them." "I see home," he replied, "and her." 13 years, the old woman mused, "yet still your spirit reaches across the water. Tell me of this love that defies time." Kenneth's voice grew soft with memory. "Imagine the brightest star in the sky. Now imagine it has taken human form, brilliant, beautiful, unstoppable. That's Alana. She walks into a room and the air itself seems to hold its breath. When she speaks, wisdom flows like clear water. When she moves..." He trailed off, lost in remembrance of their last moments together. "We made a promise to keep ourselves only for each other, no matter how long the separation, to build something greater than ourselves. And you believe she keeps this promise still?" "I know it," he said with quiet certainty, "as surely as I know the sun will rise." 1964 brought the Civil Rights Act, and with it, new opportunities for Alana's vision. She expanded the education centers into full universities, opened international branches of Rose and Company, and continued to use Western Steel's resources to fund social progress. "The Ice Queen thaws," speculated one magazine headline after she was photographed dancing at a charity gala. But those who knew her saw the truth. The watch still ticked at her throat, keeping time with a heart that beat for only one man. Her beauty had matured into something extraordinary, not just physical perfection, but the kind of inner radiance that comes from absolute certainty in one's path. On Matunga, Kenneth marked his 40th birthday by completing a comprehensive record of the tribe's healing practices. His journal, written in both English and their language, would be his gift to the world and to Alana's hospitals, if he ever made it home. The tribe had grown more prosperous under his guidance, trading cautiously with passing ships while maintaining their independence, but they still watched him carefully, especially near the beach where boats might anchor. 1965 dawned with omens of change. American military vessels began appearing more frequently in the waters near Matunga, their presence both threat and promise to Kenneth's hopes of rescue. "The world grows smaller," Chief Mako observed. "Soon our isolation will end." "All isolation ends," Kenneth replied, thinking of Alana. "The question is whether we choose the moment or let it choose us." In Pacifica, Alana celebrated her 33rd birthday by opening the Kenneth James Paul Memorial Hospital, a state-of-the-art facility that served all races equally. The press called it the crown jewel of her empire, but few understood its true significance. "Why keep his name alive?" a reporter asked during the opening ceremony. "After 15 years, surely—" "Time," Alana interrupted, her voice carrying that familiar mix of honey and steel, "is meaningless to the heart. Kenneth James Paul saw the future when others saw only barriers. Everything I've built is a step toward that future." That night, in her private suite at the hospital, she added another entry to the letter she'd been writing for 15 years. "My dearest Kenneth, today I put your name on our greatest achievement yet. The hospital will save thousands of lives, change countless futures, just as you changed mine. They call me powerful now, influential. The newspapers debate whether I'm a saint or a revolutionary. But they don't understand that everything I've built has been a lighthouse guiding you home. I wear your watch every day. Its ticking reminds me of your heartbeat that last night, when you held me close without touching, when our promise filled the air between us with electricity. I still feel you, in every quiet moment, every triumph, every step forward. They say 15 years is too long to wait, too long to believe. They don't understand that some loves transcend time itself. Come back to me, my love. I'm keeping our promise, all our promises. Forever yours, Alana. The watch ticked steadily as she wrote, its rhythm echoing across the Pacific to where Kenneth stood on his nightly beach vigil, watching the increasing military traffic with growing hope. Soon, he thought, soon the waiting would end, soon their promise would be fulfilled. But fate had other plans, and the seeds of hope would need to grow stronger still before their harvest time arrived. Chapter 9. The Escape. By 1966, the increasing presence of military vessels near Matunga had kindled a desperate hope in Kenneth's heart. At 41, his body had grown lean and weathered from island life, but his eyes still burned with the same determination that had built steel empires. The tribe's vigilance had relaxed over 16 years, believing time had finally broken his desire to leave. They were wrong. Every passing ship, every distant aircraft had only strengthened his resolve to return to Alana. "The gods test us," Chief Marco announced one stormy evening. "Strange ships bring strange diseases. We need your healing more than ever." Kenneth studied the tribal leader's face, lined with age and worry. A new illness had indeed struck the village, brought by contact with the outside world. But in this crisis, he saw opportunity. "The sacred caves," he said carefully. "The healing plants there grow stronger in the rainy season. Let me gather them." The caves lay on the island's far side, where the military ships most frequently passed. The chief hesitated, but the sight of his suffering people decided him. "Take Tao with you." Tao, now Kenneth's closest friend, understood immediately. That night, as they prepared for the journey, he spoke softly. "You will try again, won't you?" "I must." Kenneth checked his carefully hidden supplies, a watertight package of tribal medicines, star charts, and his detailed journals. "Will you stop me?" Tao was quiet for a long moment. "For 16 years, I've watched you love a woman across the great water. Your faith shames us all." He pressed a small carved pendant into Kenneth's hand. "May it protect you on your journey home." In Pacifica, Alana Rose had become one of the most powerful women in America. At 34, her business empire spanned continents, but she still wore Kenneth's watch, still kept their promise. "They're calling you the Black Queen of Wall Street now," her grandmother remarked, reading the morning paper. "They can call me what they like." Alana adjusted investment reports on her desk. "As long as our work continues." The work had indeed grown beyond anything they'd imagined in 1950. The education centers had become universities, the hospitals research centers, the boutiques international fashion houses. Yet every enterprise still served their original purpose, breaking down barriers, creating opportunity. On Matunga, Kenneth and Tao reached the caves as a massive storm system approached. "The gods speak in the thunder," Tao observed. "Yes," Kenneth agreed, watching a distant military vessel through the storm clouds. "They say it's time." That night, as lightning split the sky, Kenneth made his final bid for freedom. The storm provided cover as he slipped away from the caves, making his way to the cliff where he'd hidden a small canoe of his own design. But the gods had one final test. Halfway to the beach, a child's scream pierced the storm. One of the village girls had followed them, becoming lost in the tempest. Every instinct urged Kenneth toward the military ship he could see through the rain, but that cry— "Damn it," he whispered, turning back. He found the girl huddled in a hollow tree, feverish and frightened. By the time he got her to safety, the ship had moved on. Tao found him on the beach, staring after it with tears mixing with the rain. "The gods chose for you," Tao said gently. "No." Kenneth's voice was steel. "I chose, as I chose 16 years ago when that same fever nearly killed me. But this is the last time." He spent the next 2 years preparing more carefully than ever. He learned the military vessels' patterns, noted their equipment, studied their protocols through his hidden telescope. The tribe's trust in him had never been higher, which only added to his guilt. "You've been a blessing to us," Kaya told him as they worked with healing herbs. "But even blessings must end." Finally, in late 1968, everything aligned. A massive storm was approaching, and 3 military vessels had anchored nearby, waiting it out. The tribe was distracted by preparations for a sacred festival. Kenneth waited until nightfall, then slipped away with only his medicines, journals, and Tao's pendant. The small canoe he'd built and hidden over months was exactly where he'd left it. "Forgive me," he whispered to the island that had been his prison and sanctuary for 18 years. The storm struck with biblical fury, but Kenneth had learned to read these waters better than any navigator. He used the wind and currents to his advantage, steering toward the nearest ship's lights. Lightning revealed his tiny craft to the USS Hamilton's watch crew. As waves threatened to swallow him, a spotlight found his position. "This is the United States Navy!" A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Identify yourself!" "Kenneth James Paul," he shouted back. "American citizen, shipwrecked 18 years ago." The rescue itself was nearly fatal. The waves had grown too fierce for small craft, forcing Kenneth to swim the final distance. A rescue diver reached him just as exhaustion threatened to drag him under. On the ship's deck, wrapped in blankets, he finally allowed himself to believe he was free. He was going home. The news traveled fast. The dead man wasn't dead. The lost millionaire had been found. But in his first communication to the mainland, Kenneth had only one message. "Tell Alana Rose I'm coming home. Tell her I kept my promise." In Pacifica, Alana was in a board meeting when her secretary burst in, tears streaming down her face. The room fell silent as she read the naval telegram. "Kenneth James Paul, rescued, stop alive and recovering, stop arriving Pearl Harbor, 2 weeks, stop." The watch at her throat ticked steadily as the world spun around her. 18 years of faith vindicated in a few simple words. "I told you," she whispered to the stunned room. "I told you he'd come back." The storm struck with biblical fury, but Kenneth had learned to read these waters better than any navigator. He used the wind and currents to his advantage, steering toward the nearest ship's lights. Lightning revealed his tiny craft to the USS Hamilton's watch crew. As waves threatened to swallow him, a spotlight found his position. "This is the United States Navy," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Identify yourself." "Kenneth James Paul," he shouted back. "American citizen, shipwrecked 18 years ago." The rescue itself was nearly fatal. The waves had grown too fierce for small craft, forcing Kenneth to swim the final distance. A rescue diver reached him just as exhaustion threatened to drag him under. On the ship's deck, wrapped in blankets, he finally allowed himself to believe. He was free. He was going home. The news traveled fast. The dead man wasn't dead. The lost millionaire had been found. But in his first communication to the mainland, Kenneth had only one message. "Tell Alana Rose I'm coming home. Tell her I kept my promise." In Pacifica, Alana was in a board meeting when her secretary burst in, tears streaming down her face. The room fell silent as she read the naval telegram. "Kenneth James Paul, rescued, stop alive and recovering, stop arriving Pearl Harbor, 2 weeks. Stop." The watch at her throat ticked steadily as the world spun around her. 18 years of faith vindicated in a few simple words. "I told you," she whispered to the stunned room. "I told you he'd come back." The news media exploded. Reporters camped outside her offices, demanding interviews, wanting to know how she'd known, why she'd waited, what would happen now. But Alana had eyes only for the Pacific, counting the days until the military transport would bring him home. Each night, she took out the silk dress he'd given her, unworn all these years except in private moments. Soon, she told her reflection. Very soon. Kenneth's recovery in Pearl Harbor took 6 weeks. His body, though strong from island life, needed time to readjust. Modern foods upset his system. Modern sounds overwhelmed him, but his mind remained sharp, focused on one goal. You understand, the military doctor said, that significant time has passed. People change. She waited, Kenneth interrupted with absolute certainty. As I waited. Some promises transcend time. Finally, in early 1969, a military aircraft touched down in San Francisco. Kenneth stood at the door, his heart pounding. Would she be there? Would she recognize him? Would she still want him after all these years? The door opened, sunlight flooded in, and there she was. 18 years had only enhanced her beauty, added dignity to her grace. The watch, his grandfather's watch, gleamed at her throat. Their eyes met across the years, across the distance, across all the barriers that had tried to separate them. Time stood still. Their promise, kept through tragedy and triumph, separation and success, was about to be fulfilled. Chapter 10. The Return. Early 1970 dawned with a crisp clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of this momentous day. Kenneth James Paul, now 45, stood at the foot of the military aircraft stairs, his heart thundering in his chest. Nearly 2 decades of island life had weathered his once smooth features, turned his businessman's hands rough with work, but his eyes still held that same intensity that had captured Alana's heart in 1950. She stood waiting, a vision in deep blue that made his breath catch. At 38, Alana Rose had blossomed into an even more stunning woman than the teenager he'd left behind. Success and determination had added regal grace to her natural beauty, and the watch at her throat caught the morning sun like a beacon calling him home. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met across the tarmac. Everything he'd survived, the shipwreck, the years of isolation, the desperate escape, crystallized into this single moment. One step, another. His legs felt leaden, his throat tight with emotion. The crowd of reporters and officials faded away until there was only her, only them, only this moment, 20 years in the making. Alana, he whispered as he drew near, his voice rough from disuse of English. She swayed slightly, her composure cracking. The watch at her throat ticked steadily, marking each precious second of their reunion. Kenneth. Then she was in his arms, and the world exploded back into full color. She felt so small against his chest, yet he could sense the strength in her, the power she'd grown into. Her scent, jasmine, just as he remembered, overwhelmed his senses. You waited, he breathed into her hair. You really waited. Always, she whispered back. I never doubted, not for a moment. Cameras flashed around them, reporters shouted questions, but they remained locked in their own world. 20 years of separation poured into that embrace, healing wounds time had left open. Miss Rose! A reporter's voice cut through their bubble. How does it feel to have your faith vindicated? Alana turned in Kenneth's arms, facing the press with the poise that had made her famous. Faith isn't about vindication. It's about keeping promises, no matter how long the wait. The drive to her estate, their estate, he corrected himself, revealed how much had changed. Pacifica had grown, modernized, but he recognized the bones of the city he'd left behind. What struck him most were the signs of Alana's influence. Rose education centers, hospitals bearing his name, boutiques that employed people of all races. You built all this? He asked, wonder in his voice. We built it, she corrected softly. Everything I created was part of our shared dream. Every step forward was a step toward you. The estate gates opened automatically, revealing gardens that took his breath away. Native flowers from the Pacific Islands bloomed alongside roses, a beautiful fusion of his two worlds. "I studied everything I could about South Pacific plants," Alana explained, watching his face. "I wanted you to have pieces of home when you returned." "You're my home," he said simply. Inside, the mansion reflected her success while maintaining touches of the past. His grandfather's portrait hung in the foyer, and he noticed tribal art tastefully displayed. She'd researched his lost years thoroughly. In his private suite, everything had been prepared for his return. Modern clothes waited in the closet, but they'd thoughtfully included loose, comfortable garments, similar to what he'd grown used to on the island. "The doctors said you might need time to readjust," Alana explained, hovering near the door. "I can give you space." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. Softer, he added. "Please. I've had 20 years of space." She moved closer, her eyes taking in every detail of his changed appearance. He did the same, noting how time had only enhanced her beauty, adding character to her features and wisdom to her gaze. "Your eyes are the same," she whispered, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "Everything else has changed. But your eyes—" His hand covered hers, pressing it to his cheek. The simple touch sent electricity through them both. "Tell me," he said roughly. "Tell me everything I missed." They sat in his sweet sitting room as she recounted the years. How she'd built their empire piece by piece, never wavering in her belief that he lived. How she'd faced down prejudice and opposition, using his teachings and her own strength to succeed. "They called me the Ice Queen," she said with a small smile. "They couldn't understand why I wouldn't marry, wouldn't even date." "Because of our promise," he breathed. "Because of our promise." She touched the watch at her throat. "Every tick reminded me of you. Every second brought us closer to this moment." Kenneth's hand went to the scar where his own watch had been. "I lost your photo in the shipwreck," he told her, "but I saw your face every night in the stars. Taught myself to track time by them, counting the days until I could return." "Show me," she whispered. He led her to the balcony, pointing out constellations now visible in the darkening sky. As he spoke, his tribal accent became more pronounced, revealing how deeply those years had marked him. "This one," he indicated a bright star, "I named for you. The natives called it the heart of the night. I told them it was my guide home." Alana leaned back against him, and he inhaled sharply at the contact. Even this innocent touch tested the boundaries of their long-kept promise. "I saved all the newspapers," she said softly. "Documented everything you missed. Civil rights, space travel, medical breakthroughs. I wanted you to have a bridge back to this world. My bridge is you," he replied. "Only you." The evening deepened around them, stars emerging one by one. In the gardens below, fountains played gentle music, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine rose like incense. "Are you real?" she whispered suddenly. "I've dreamed this moment so many times." In answer, he turned her to face him. Slowly, reverently, he touched the watch at her throat. Its tick matched his heartbeat, proof that time had not stopped but had finally brought them back together. "I'm real," he assured her, "and I kept every promise. Every one." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Kenneth, my Kenneth." He gathered her close, careful even now to maintain the boundaries of their promise. Tomorrow would bring challenges. His readjustment to modern life, the media frenzy, the business empire they would now rule together. But tonight was for them alone. "Welcome home," she breathed against his chest. "I am home," he replied. "I am finally, truly home." The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had guided him through 20 years of separation. But now they shone on a different scene, two souls reunited, two hearts beating in sync, two promises kept against all odds. The world would have questions, demands, expectations, but here in this moment there was only truth, only love, only them. And in the garden below, the flowers from two different worlds bloomed together under the Pacific stars, a living testament to the power of promises kept in love that transcends time itself. Chapter 11. Healing Hearts. Mid-1970 brought challenges that tested both Kenneth and Alana in unexpected ways. The physical demands of returning to civilization wore heavily on Kenneth's island-adapted body, yet each day brought small victories in his journey back to the modern world. Dawn found him, as always, on the beach house veranda, watching the sunrise with the same reverence he'd developed on Matunga. At 45, his weathered features and lean strength spoke of his years among the tribe, but his eyes held both ancient wisdom and fresh wonder at the world he'd rejoined. Alana joined him, as she did every morning, bringing a carefully planned breakfast that bridged his two worlds. She'd worked with nutritionists to create meals that wouldn't shock his system while gradually reintroducing him to modern foods. "The papaya is from Hawaii," she explained, watching him examine the fruit. "I thought it might be similar to what you had on the island." Kenneth smiled, touched by her thoughtfulness. "On Matunga, we had smaller ones, sweeter." He picked up the fork, consciously reminding himself not to use his hands as he'd grown accustomed to. Kaya, the healer, she used to say the smaller fruits held more spirit. Alana leaned forward, eager for these glimpses into his lost years. "Tell me more about her. About all of them." As the morning sun warmed them, Kenneth shared stories of his island life. The daily rituals, the healing ceremonies, the way the tribe marked time by stars rather than clocks. Alana listened intently, noting how his accent shifted when he spoke of those times, his English taking on the rhythmic cadence of the tribal language. "The hardest part," he admitted, setting down his fork, "isn't the food or the noise or even the technology. It's the pace. Everything here moves so fast, as if time is an enemy to be conquered rather than a friend to be embraced." Alana touched the watch at her throat. "I understand. These past 20 years, this watch kept time differently for me too. Each tick wasn't about moving forward, it was about moving toward you." Their eyes met across the table, and the air between them charged with unspoken longing. Even after months of reunion, they maintained their promise of physical purity, though it grew more challenging with each passing day. "The doctors say you're making remarkable progress," she said, breaking the tension, "but you don't have to push yourself so hard." Kenneth reached for her hand, his work-roughened fingers gentle against her silk-soft skin. "Every skill I relearn brings me closer to being worthy of you again." "You've always been worthy," she insisted. "Your time on the island didn't diminish you, it enriched you. Look at what your tribal medicine knowledge has already done for our hospitals." Indeed, Kenneth's integration of traditional healing practices with modern medicine had revolutionized their healthcare approach. His journal of tribal remedies had sparked intense interest in the medical community, leading to breakthroughs in natural treatments. The morning progressed into preparations for the day ahead. Kenneth stood in his closet, another challenge awaiting him. Alana had thoughtfully provided both modern suits and looser, more comfortable garments, similar to what he'd worn on the island. "The board meeting is at 10, she called from the hallway, "but we can reschedule if you're not ready." Kenneth straightened his tie with determined fingers. The simple act of dressing formally, once as natural as breathing, now required conscious thought. "No," he replied firmly. "It's time." The drive to Western Steel's headquarters revealed how much Pacifica had changed in 20 years. Kenneth watched through the car window as modern buildings reached toward the sky, their steel and glass facades reflecting the world he'd helped create and the one Alana had built in his absence. "It's overwhelming sometimes, isn't it?" Alana observed softly, noting his tense posture. The city's growth? Everything grows, he replied, his voice taking on the philosophical tone he'd learned from the tribe. The question is whether it grows with wisdom or merely with ambition. The board meeting tested his adaptation in new ways. The boardroom's fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that would have been imperceptible before, but now set his island-trained senses on edge. The rapid-fire discussion of profits and projections contrasted sharply with the measured decision-making of tribal councils. Yet when he spoke, the room fell silent. His presentation on integrating traditional healing practices with modern medicine held them spellbound. The wisdom of 20 years among indigenous healers, combined with his innate business acumen, offered perspectives none could dismiss. Mr. Paul, Harrison Wheeler, now elderly but still sharp, addressed him. Your proposal for combining tribal remedies with our medical facilities is intriguing. But surely the regulatory challenges are already being addressed, Alana interjected smoothly. Our legal team has been working with the FDA. The preliminary results from our pilot program show remarkable promise. Kenneth watched her with pride as she handled the technical questions. She'd grown into such a formidable force, yet had kept her heart pure for him. The watch at her throat caught the boardroom lights, reminding him of starlight on island waves. After the meeting, overwhelmed by the intense interaction, Kenneth felt his control slipping. Alana noticed immediately. "Thomas," she called to their driver, "take us to the beach." The short drive to their private beach brought immediate relief. Kenneth walked barefoot in the sand, letting the familiar rhythm of waves calm his overwrought senses. Alana stayed close, understanding his need for space while ensuring he didn't feel alone. "Better?" she asked as color returned to his face. "Much." He closed his eyes, breathing in the salt air. "The ocean. It's my constant. The one thing that remained the same all those years." "Is that why you chose the beach house over the estate?" He nodded, opening his eyes to gaze at the horizon where blue met blue. "The mansion is beautiful, but here I can breathe. Here I can feel both worlds without being torn between them." Alana took his hand, her touch grounding him. "I have something to show you when you're ready." At the beach house, she led him to his study. The room had been transformed. One wall held detailed maps of the South Pacific, with Motunga carefully marked. Another displayed enlarged photographs of tribal healing plants taken from his journal sketches. The desk faced the ocean, and above a skylight would allow him to see his beloved stars. "Alana," emotion made his voice rough, "this is a bridge," she finished softly. "Between your two worlds, so you never have to choose between them." The tears that came then were healing ones. Kenneth let them fall freely, something he'd learned from the tribe. That tears were not weakness, but wisdom flowing out to make room for new strength. That evening they shared a quiet dinner on the veranda. Kenneth had progressed to handling more complex foods, though he still preferred simpler fare. Their conversation flowed easily between business plans and personal memories, bridging their 20-year gap with growing confidence. "Tell me," Alana requested, "about your last night on Motunga. What were you thinking as you prepared to escape?" Kenneth's eyes grew distant with memory. "I thought of you, of this watch." He touched the timepiece at her throat, "of our promise. The stars that night. They seemed to align perfectly, as if finally granting permission for my return." Later, unable to sleep, he stood on his balcony watching those same stars. Movement below caught his eye, Alana in her private garden, wearing the silk dress he'd given her so long ago. The moonlight transformed it into liquid silver, highlighting every graceful curve. His breath caught as she moved among the flowers, unaware of his presence. Even after 20 years, she took his breath away. The dress clung to her figure, revealing the woman she'd become while maintaining the innocence of their promise. She must have felt his gaze, for she looked up suddenly. Their eyes met across the distance, and time seemed to stop. No words were needed. Their hearts spoke volumes in the silence. "Soon," he whispered to the night, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of waiting. "Very soon." In her garden, Alana touched the watch at her throat, its steady ticking matching the rhythm of her heart. Soon their promise would be fulfilled, their love finally made complete. But for now, they had this: healing hearts, bridged worlds, and a love that had conquered time itself. Kenneth's journey back to civilization continued day by day, strengthened by Alana's unwavering support and their shared vision of a future that combined the best of both his worlds. For in the end, love was not just about keeping promises or maintaining purity. It was about growing together, healing together, and building a future that honored both who they had been and who they had become. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had guided him home, now witnessing their patient journey toward final unity. Soon, very soon, their promise would be fulfilled, and 2 decades of waiting would blossom into something even more beautiful than they had imagined. Chapter 12, Promises Kept. Late 1970 arrived with the whisper of destiny. Kenneth's recovery had progressed remarkably, his strength returning along with his confidence. The fusion of Western Steel's industrial might with his tribal medicine knowledge had revolutionized their healthcare initiatives, while Alana's business acumen had taken their empire to unprecedented heights. On this particular evening, Kenneth stood in his beach house study, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold. At 45, he had regained much of his former powerful presence, though his years on Motunga had left him with an added dimension of wisdom in his eyes. The small velvet box in his hand held more than just a ring. It contained 20 years of promises finally ready to be fulfilled. He'd had it specially designed, a platinum band set with a deep blue diamond rare as their love, surrounded by smaller stones in a pattern that mimicked his beloved stars. A soft knock at his door announced Alana's arrival. She entered wearing a simple white dress that made his heart stop, elegant, powerful, and somehow innocent all at once. At 38, she had blossomed into a woman who commanded boardrooms and graced magazine covers, yet retained the pure heart that had first captured his soul. "Kenneth?" Her voice carried that familiar mix of honey and steel. "You wanted to see me." He turned from the window, drinking in the sight of her. The watch at her throat ticked steadily, marking precious seconds of anticipation. 20 years ago, he began, his voice rough with emotion, "we made a promise to keep ourselves pure for each other no matter how long the separation." Alana's hand went to the watch, her eyes never leaving his face. "A promise I've kept with every breath, as have I." He moved closer, close enough to catch the scent of jasmine in her hair. "But we made other promises too. To build something meaningful together, to change the world." She smiled softly. "The education centers, the hospitals, the opportunities we've created are just the beginning." He took her hand, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers that matched his own racing heart. "Alana Rose, you've become more than I ever dreamed possible. While I was lost, you built an empire. While I was healing others, you healed society's wounds. You kept every promise we made, and then some." Tears sparkled in her eyes as he slowly knelt before her. "Kenneth, my grandfather gave this watch to my grandmother as a promise of his return from war." He touched the timepiece at her throat. "You've worn it for 20 years, keeping time with a heart that beat only for me. Now ... He opened the velvet box, revealing the ring that sparkled like their private constellation. Now I ask you to wear this as well, to fulfill our final promise, to be my wife, my partner, my queen in all things." Alana's breath caught as she saw the ring. "It looks like the stars that guided me home," he finished. "The same stars I named for you on countless island nights." She touched the ring with trembling fingers. "All these years, all the waiting, end tonight if you say yes." "Yes," she breathed, tears flowing freely now. "Yes, today and always yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, something shifted in the air between them. 20 years of restraint, of keeping their promise, crackled with new energy. "When?" she whispered. "Now." His voice was husky with need. "Tonight. I've arranged everything, a private ceremony on the beach at midnight under our stars, unless you want something more formal." "No," she cut him off. "Tonight is perfect. Just us, the ocean, and our promises fulfilled." The ceremony was intimate and powerful. They exchanged vows with feet in the sand and hearts in the stars. The tribal pendant Kenneth had carried from Matunga was incorporated into the blessing, along with elements from both their worlds. Later, in the beach house's master suite, Kenneth waited in traditional tribal formal wear, his heart pounding as it hadn't since that first night in Pacifica so long ago. When Alana entered wearing the silk dress he'd given her 20 years before, time seemed to stop. The dress still fit perfectly, but now it graced a woman who had grown into her power while keeping her pure heart intact. Her skin glowed like polished mahogany in the candlelight, and the watch at her throat ticked in time with their racing hearts. "You kept it all these years," he breathed, taking in the sight of her. "I wore it only for myself, imagining this moment." She moved closer, and he could hear her heart racing to match his own. "Dreaming of you, Alana." His voice was rough with emotion as she reached for the buttons of his shirt. "My queen, my heart, my everything." The watch ticked steadily as promises made were finally fulfilled, as pure love bloomed into passionate completion. Their 20 years of waiting made every touch electric, every moment sacred. Later, as they lay entwined, Kenneth traced the line of her shoulder in wonder. "Worth the wait," he murmured. She smiled against his chest. "Worth every second." "Tell me again," he requested softly, "about the day you knew I was alive, when everyone else had given up hope." Alana propped herself up on one elbow, her eyes shining in the starlight that streamed through the windows. "I never needed to know. I simply believed." The watch kept ticking, and so did my heart, both beating for you, keeping time until you returned. He pulled her close, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her faith. "And now we build the future we dreamed of." She touched his face tenderly. "Together, as we always planned." The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had guided him home, the same stars now reflected in her eyes. Their promise, kept pure through 20 years of separation, had blossomed into something even more beautiful than they'd imagined. For love, they had discovered, was not just about keeping promises. It was about becoming more than you ever thought possible, about holding faith when the world doubted, about building dreams that outlasted time itself. And now, finally, their time had come. Not just to love, but to live the dream they'd built separately and would now share together. The watch ticked on, marking not separation now, but unity. Not longing, but fulfillment. Not promises made, but promises gloriously, completely, eternally kept. Subscribe if you loved